not only have they written books on the children, Rachel has concentrated on Churchill's girls, and Josh, you have very kindly concentrated on Churchill's only son, Randolph.
It's convenient, isn't it? Yeah.
It's so convenient.
The division of labour.
But we were chatting earlier, and I said to you I was going to introduce this as being a story of depression, disappointment, alcoholism, elopement, and suicide, and occasional happiness. And you both kind of jumped on me and said, no. But I'm going to start and ask you both. So starting with Rachel, if I may, what inspired you? Why did you decide, you've written other books, what inspired you about these girls, these women?
Well, I was researching another project actually on Churchill's animals in the Churchill archives, and by chance I stumbled on this letter from Sarah to Winston, and it was just so intimate and informal. It made me want to know more about the woman who'd written it and her relationship with her father. And it stuck in my mind for a couple of years because I was working on other things and it didn't go away. And when you find something that sticks like that, I think it's something you have to follow on. And so when I looked into Winston's daughters, I just found they had this tremendous story full of passion, drama, and sadly, quite a lot of tragedy.
And how many daughters did Winston have?
He had 4, and little Marigold, the third daughter, died well before her time when she was only 3 from septicemia. But the others, Diana was the eldest, born in 1909, then Sarah in 1914, and then the baby of the family, who had the most successful life, was Mary. And they were all very different women and followed very different trajectories. But what united them was they were very devoted to each other and their parents.
Right. And this is a picture from your book. And Clemmie's there with the babies, as it were, in 2 of the pictures. Which of the babies have we got here?
Well, we've got, first of all, Diana. And then we've got, at the bottom, we've got Sarah, who looks very cute there, doesn't she, with her hands.
Yes,
her face in her hands, who was known as the bumblebee, and you can see why there. That would be red hair, a sort of mop of red hair. And then we've got little Marigold, who was born in 1918. And in fact, Clemmie didn't really want another baby at that point. But once Marigold was born, everyone doted on her. And it was one of the massive tragedies of the family when she died prematurely. And that was to really shape the way the Churchills then ran their family life from then on. And so Mary was given a much better childhood than the earlier children, because it had been rather nomadic for the first 3. And after that, a proper home was established at Chartwell with secure staffing, with a really good nanny for Mary. And her life turned out very differently from the others.
Right. And Josh, what inspired you to...
well, it was a cameo that Randolph made in another book. It was a book, Ben McIntyre's book about the early days of the SAS, and there was a bit in the desert, and then suddenly this sort of fat, angry, vulnerable, combustible, arrogant, strange man sort of billows into the pages. And I just thought, who is this person? And then I began to think more about, what sort of constellation of factors must have led to him being like that. What must it like to be the son of a man of such an overpowering charisma as Winston Churchill and overpowering fame? And how do you cope? How do you sort of fashion an identity or a meaning for your own life in that shadow? And I also, to my shame, I guess, that one is so accustomed to seeing Winston as a sort of the war leader with the big cigar. And there's not, and it's easy to forget that there was a sort of very emotional, vulnerable, unusual human being that sort of lived alongside that caricature. And I thought this was a good way of approaching him from a different direction.
It's interesting, you've just used those words to describe Randolph, and yet, here's this wonderful photograph of Winston as a relatively young man, And you know, that little toddler with that little foot and his little
I
toes.
know.
And, you know, you can't believe that he grew up into the sort of man that he did. Looking at that.
Well, I mean, he was born just beautiful, and I think was beautiful well into his 20s. And I mean, the sort of sad thing is, you know, as people will see as they watch the slides, he becomes progressively more obese. You know, his skin becomes mottled. I mean, he's a sort of a sort of version of Dorian Gray. You know, that his life and his failures and his bitterness are all written on his face. And you know, it's a sort of parable for the sort of waste of his promise.
Right. And so just to backtrack a moment, so now we kind of know what inspired you. So how long did it take you both to research, and you know, where did I wonder if you crossed over at all, because both your books were published this year, so I wonder if you were both in the same place, you know, in an archive somewhere before you'd actually
I can't
met.
believe we weren't both at Churchill College at some point.
Yeah.
It seems impossible that we weren't.
Yeah.
Everything. I mean, I've never been in a more complete archive. I mean, I've been in a lot of archives in my career, but the Churchill one just has everything, doesn't it? I mean, it pulls it all together. So actually, with my other books, I've had to travel around more in a way, but so much work really was at Cambridge for me. And it was 2019, you know, just before the pandemic, I did a lot of my research at Churchill College. What about you, Josh?
Yeah, it was through 2018 and 2019. And I did, so the very, very vast majority was at Churchill College. And then I went to the JFK Memorial Library in Boston, and also the Library of Congress in Washington, which has Pamela Harrison's papers.
Sadly, I didn't get to physically go.
Yeah.
I only had it sort of emailed to me, so not quite as glamorous. But again, the Franklin Delano Roosevelt sort of library, for me, it was looking at Gil Wynant there.
When you were both, or, you know, as you were doing your research, I think, Rachel, you discovered that the girls were often overlooked in favour of Randolph. In what sort of ways?
I think in all ways. Winston, well, I really, this is your story, Josh, but Winston wanted, you know, the son, and believed only men could go into politics. And I think if you ask, you know, the average person about Winston's children, they'll know about Randolph, because his sort of enfant terrible behavior as he got older dominated, and people didn't know about the girls. So when I was writing my book, I didn't write a tremendous amount about Randolph. I only touched on him when he came in to the picture. And I wanted to concentrate on the girls, because I think as there were so many charismatic figures in the family, it sort of overshadowed them. Whereas actually their lives, if they'd been in any other family, would have made them big stars. You know, there were elopements, affairs with very powerful men, suicides. Sarah became a film star. You know, there was so much going on with the girls. But when you put that in a family with people like Randolph and even their cousins, the Mitford girls, they get overshadowed. So I sort of try to keep the others in the background and bring the girls center stage for once.
And were the girls aware, do you think? You know, did they think, hang on a minute, you know, Randolph's getting all the attention here? What do you think?
Yeah, there's a great passage in one of Mary's diaries that she kept through the war, saying, you know, and Mary is this impeccably fair, kind, generous person. You know, she's very Christian in sort of every sense of the word, but she clearly is very frustrated by her brother and the sort of strange complexity of her brother's bond with Winston. And at one time she says, you know, there's nothing that we can do that could ever top even the smallest achievement of Randolph. You know, we could achieve everything, and we still wouldn't be given the same attention or the same love or the same care. You know, I think. Although I think that would change, I think certainly in the first half of their lives, and I'm sure Rachel would have a stronger sense of this, that they were very aware of there being a sort of hierarchy within the family. I mean, even between Randolph and Clementine, when sort of eminent people came to visit Chartwell, Randolph would be pushed in front of Clementine and invited to them first. You know, Randolph would be allowed to come and sit up with with Lloyd George or whomever smoking cigars and giving his opinion about world events at the age of 14, whereas Clementine was sort of forced to sit upstairs with a tray, furiously resenting the fact that she'd been exiled again. So
that's extraordinary. Sorry, Rachel, go on.
Yeah, I think it was very detrimental really for Diana, because Diana, born in 1909, 2 years before Randolph, was the firstborn. But the minute the little Chumberley, as they called Randolph, came along, he was the heir apparent. And actually, Winston even writes to Clementine that he couldn't help finding Randolph a more appealing character than the more shy and sort of self-effacing Diana. And when she was a little girl, as they were close in age, the two were together a lot. And they had a very close relationship, Randolph and Diana. They were a terrible twosome for a bit. But it would be always Randolph who was invited to recite poetry at the table if someone like Lloyd George was there. Or, one guest came and, the worth of the girls was shown by the fact that Randolph was given a £5 note and Diana £1. So it was really dark from the start for them.
I think this photograph's quite interesting because it was taken at Chartwell, and you've got Winston there, obviously, but look who's centre stage. He's smack in the middle of that photo, isn't he?
Yeah.
And
it's just sort of astonishing. I mean, you can see how confident he is even at that age, and comfortable being there. The position of his shoulders, the sort of slouch of him. He's a child who's accustomed to being listened to. You can see that in that photograph. He's confident that when he speaks, people will stop talking and see.
It's quite interesting, isn't it? Because we were talking about this photo and saying he's actually 16 and he just doesn't look it. But what I also think is interesting is you've got Diana Mitford, the great beauty there. And when he was that age, he actually was in love with Diana. But I mean, she looks a real woman and he looks a little boy. So it suggests he never really saw himself as others saw him, maybe because he saw himself reflected all the time through his father's love and eyes on him.
And when we were looking at this photograph earlier, we haven't spoken in any great depth about, any of them really, but this is Diana, his sister, and you were saying that it's a lovely photograph in that it just captures her expression, because she was a lot of fun, wasn't she?
Yeah, she was. I mean, she had a great sense of humour, and during the war, when things were tough, Winston would have Diana to checkers because she'd make him laugh. She'd come back with stories of her volunteering in hospitals and things like that. And because Diana eventually had a very tragic end and committed suicide, we too often see her just through that light, whereas actually she was much more than that. She had a great sense of humour, but she also was really, really interested in politics and actually the philosophy of politics and political ideas. And before she was married, she went round with Winston a lot to meetings when Clemmy didn't want to. So there's much more to Diana than this tragic figure. And I love that photo. I mean, it shows her happy and young.
I think there's also something slightly subversive about her expression there, as if she knows there's something, as if she's been told a joke that no one else is in on. And I think, Rachel will sort of be able to talk more confidently about this, but I have this sense of her as being a tiny bit removed from the rest of the family, having not quite at odds, but she was the only one that probably didn't vote for Winston in 1945, and then there's a sense of her not quite satirizing the rest of the family, but acting as a sort of counterpoint to that ferocious loyalty that the rest of them showed all the time.
Yes, I mean, she had a difficult relationship with Clemmy. I mean, they had a very problematic one. She always felt she didn't measure up to what Clemmy wanted. But that subversive idea is interesting because, as you say, in 1945, there's a letter from Clemmy saying that we had a dreadful dinner with Diana and Duncan. And Diana was saying that she's going to vote for the Commonwealth Party and believed that was the way forward now. I mean, I hope she's not becoming a communist. And so Diana really needed to get away from all the other members of the family who were overpowering her. And she made a very unsuccessful first marriage that only lasted a short time. And some said that was just to get away from that very intense atmosphere of being at the dinner table with all the Churchills and everyone competing for attention. And her reaction around the dinner table would be to chatter away garrulously, whereas Sarah would clam up and Winston would call her an oyster because she didn't give up her secrets. So I think you're right that Diana was sort of an outsider within the family. And certainly when she suffered badly from depression, that's something she said, that she didn't feel accepted.
I think just to illustrate the point about her having a sense of humour, I think even from a very early age, this is a page from the visitor book at Blenheim Palace. And as I'm sure people will know, that Winston was born here at Blenheim, and they were frequent visitors here, and they often spent Christmases here. And it's lovely to look at the visitors book, because it starts, you see Winston Churchill signing his name, and then you see Clementine Hosier as she was, and then you see Winston and Clementine when they were married, and then you start to see the children appear. And second from the bottom, you've got Diana. And this must have been shortly after Randolph was born, so perhaps in 1912, 1913. And she's written his name and then made him do a little cross and put his mark. And, you think even at that age, she clearly had a lovely sense of humour. And I think, Rachel, as you say, she was caring, etc. Then while we've got her, tell us a little bit about the course that her life took.
Well, she found it really hard to find a niche. It was hard for women of that generation anyway, and most were meant to be debutantes and make a good marriage. And unfortunately for her, she came out in the same debutante season as her Mitford cousin, the great beauty Diana Mitford. And having two Dianas on the scene at the same time, and one much more beautiful than you, who is the Deb of the season, who makes a marriage to a very wealthy man, Brian Guinness, at the end of the season, didn't do a lot for Diana Churchill's confidence. But she didn't really just want to be a social butterfly. She hated the season and being dragged around, these country houses trying to find a mate. But she also found it hard to find a career. And she went to drama school thinking she'd be like to be an actress, but she didn't last very long there. Sarah said that was because she was too individualistic. She didn't really want to be directed by anyone. She then had to go nursing for a brief time one summer, looking after hop pickers and their children. That wasn't her. There was then a chance that she might have a film career. That fell through. And then she had this pretty disastrous first marriage. Very shortly afterwards, she married Duncan Sandys, who was a Conservative politician, the love of her life, and had 3 children with him. And really, she wasn't someone who particularly wanted the limelight. She just wanted a nice family life. But that began to go wrong in the 1950s. It seems Duncan Sandys was a womanizer. At the same time, she was suffering from mental health problems. Mm-hmm. The family said it's hard to tell whether the mental health problems or the womanizing, which came first, or they played off each other.
Yeah.
That was really hard for her. And she had a number of very serious breakdowns. And, that made her very aware of what mental health was like, both for herself and other people. And she just seemed to have found her niche in the 1960s, working for the Samaritans. Right. And very quietly, very anonymously, using the name Mrs. Spencer, rather than her married name or the Churchill name. She helped a lot of people. There were letters written to the paper after her death saying what a wonderful, compassionate person she was. And everyone thought her life was improving and she was where she should be. But tragically, in October 1963, she committed suicide. And it was such a sad end.
And at that time, her parents were still alive and very elderly, and her siblings, I think all of them were still alive, weren't they, except for Marigold. So how awful to have to cope with this further tragedy. It's it beggars belief, really. I'm just moving on. So Diana was the eldest, and next came Randolph. So I would imagine Churchill, being Churchill, was relieved that he'd had a son. Heaven knows if he hadn't had a son. So Josh, what was it like, do you think, for Churchill when he finally, here we are?
Well, apparently he was so happy. He had more emotion than he knew what to do with. So he had to get on a horse and ride around Richmond Park a couple of times to sort of, work off that joy, which says a lot about him I mean, I think he was ecstatic. He had this very sort of strong, almost mystic sense of the importance of dynasties and of sort of one generation handing power on to the next. You know, he had that very strong sense of destiny and his own place in history. And I mean, from the moment that Randolph took his first breath, it was clear that Winston had mapped out his life for him. That he was to follow Winston, maybe even go further than Winston. You know, I think he was to have a political career, a glittering political career. He was to become a sort of aristocratic paragon, and Winston put a lot of effort into ensuring that. You know, that we talked about the ways he sort of pushed Randolph forward. He was clearly obsessed, you know, and enchanted by his son. So there was nothing that Randolph, who was an exceptionally naughty child, could do that would ever lead to Winston telling him off or reproving him. You know, when Randolph did something naughty, Winston would usually laugh and congratulate him. You know, that he'd conspire with him against the teachers that were telling Winston that Randolph wasn't behaving properly. And there were some occasions when I think he crossed the line. He poured a pot of his own urine on Lloyd George's head, and I think that was a bit beyond the pale. But mostly, you know, that he'd hand him cigars and port and tell him how wonderful he was. And so it's absolutely no surprise that by the time he reached his, you know, became a teenage boy, he was incredibly confident. You know, he was this handsome beauty. He'd inherited his mother's beauty. He'd inherited Winston's charisma. I mean, in fact, in lots of ways, he had more immediate gifts than Winston. Winston was always a very nervous speaker who had to prepare his speeches in advance, whereas Randolph could speak brilliantly off the cuff. He had a photographic memory. You know, he was funny, he was clever, he was opinionated. But he also had, like his sister, there were sort of other undercurrents running beneath that.
So, you know, you've described, as you say, that he could get away with virtually murder by the sounds of things, and he was still the apple of his father's eye. I mean, that must have been devastating for the rest of the family, you know, because we all, you know, I think at whatever age we are, we all want to please our parents. What must it have been like for everyone else?
I think Mary, well, we know Mary did from the diaries, perhaps resented it most, because you're right, all of the children wanted to please Winston in particular, and Clementine in a sort of secondary way. And what the girls did during the war, they did wanting to obviously serve their country, but also please their father and make him proud. And I think particularly Mary said during the war, you know, how Randolph would rush in and disrupt his father so much that Clementine in the end tried to ban him from the house because she thought he'd give Winston a stroke. And on one occasion, there was a big row over dinner during the war, and he actually hit Sarah. But I think he felt betrayed by the family, didn't he, Josh? You know, because of things that were going on as well. I mean, it was just such a difficult dynamic between them all.
Yeah, I mean, I think Winston's, you know, the whole family is quite contradictory, and I think Winston is sort of more than any of the others. And I think there's a sort of the two sides of Winston. There's the side of Winston that slept in silk pajamas or in silk underwear, and there's the part of Winston that likes to be where bullets are flying. And I think he expressed that in his choice of people, that some people he wanted to sort of act as the silk underwear and to support him and do his work for him and help him achieve all the things he wanted to do. I mean, and Clemmy clearly falls into that space. And then there was another part of him that sought out people to excite him, to sort of get his pulse going. And, you know, like Lord Beaverbrook or Lloyd George would be people like that, you know, mercurial, unreliable, eccentrics. And Randolph, I think, fell into that category. And I think maybe both sides could never quite understand the other, and never quite understood the value that the other sort of personality had for Winston. You know, that Randolph couldn't understand how important it was that his mother or Mary offered Winston a steadying presence, and Mary and Clementine couldn't understand the extent to which Winston needed that spark of excitement and that sort of danger and that strangeness.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting, isn't it? Because Mary took on a lot of Clementine's views, and Clementine had such a problem with Randolph, didn't she? So Clementine and Mary were the closest of any of the daughters. Clementine adored Mary. She had real problems with Diana, and she went in various stages of problems with Sarah, but Mary was the constant and the rock. And so I think a lot of Mary's attitude to Randolph was taking on what her mother felt as well. And I love your description of Winston needing this sort of silk underwear effect. And definitely as he got older, he needed more of that cosmic song. And that's very much what Mary and her husband, Christopher Soames, provided. As he became older and more vulnerable, he wanted to be sort of cocooned. And, you know, Randolph certainly couldn't do that.
I think also it's interesting about the, you know, again, the support, because just going back to Randolph, so right up to the time of the Second World War, 1940, Churchill becomes Prime Minister. So he's finally achieved this, you know, his destiny. And then Randolph, having been kind of cosseted and shaped and driven towards being even more successful than his father, is almost left out in the cold. Is that right?
Yeah, I mean, I think it must have been a brutal experience for him. And I mean, I think you can make a case for Randolph being the closest person to Winston right through the 30s. And you could probably make a case that the sort of emotional support he gave him allowed him to carry on. You know, that he, more than anyone else, believed absolutely in Winston, more than Clementine. They spent an unfeasible amount of time in each other's company. And, you know, to a great sense, you know, to a great extent, there was a sense of equality about their partnership, mainly because I think both of them realised that Winston was getting older, and that there was a sort of unspoken sense that Randolph would sort of inherit the future. You know, that they were talking about leaving Chartwell to him before the war. And then just at the moment, you know, when he thought his father was going to step away, and that the scene was going to be open for him to sort of become himself and become a great figure in his own right, suddenly his father sort of saves the country. But yeah, I mean, in that first government that Winston forms, it's full of, you know, the sort of allies, the scanty number of allies they'd had through the 30s, but also people that had been sort of diehard enemies of Winston. There was no place for Randolph, and there shouldn't have been, because he was a 29-year-old lieutenant with very little experience. He was combustible. He was a drunkard. He left maps in cars. He couldn't, you know, he was drunk a lot of the time. He was in huge amounts of debt. You know, there was absolutely no reasonable reason why he should have a significant role in his father's government.
But he found... Oh, sorry, go on.
Sorry, and then so that meant the only sort of avenue he had left was to go and fight, because I think he knew, I mean, just as Rachel was saying, you know, that all the children are desperately, constantly right through their lives trying to please Winston, and he knew that the only way that you could impress the sort of fighter within Winston was to go and fight. You know, he wouldn't be respected by his father if he were to just be sort of hide in England. But there was when Randolph's existence was so important to Winston's balance, that Winston wouldn't let him go abroad. You know, he would tell people that, you know, if anything would happen to Randolph, he didn't know whether he could carry on. So Randolph was stuck in this strange position where he wasn't allowed to have any meaningful responsibility at home, and he wasn't, for a while, allowed to go abroad and sort of prove himself. And he wasn't very good at processing frustration. And when he was angry and upset, he caused terrible scenes. Yeah, you know, which Rachel has sort of alluded to.
And so at this stage, I'm going to jump in if I may. So Randolph was kind of just sidelined, for want of a better word. It was a time when the girls started to come into their own, and certainly during the war, I think it's true to say that Winston started perhaps to realise that actually women were quite useful, you know.
Yeah, I think it totally changed his outlook, what they did in the war. And he actually wrote to Randolph saying, your sisters have taken some of the hardest paths, and how proud he was of them, because each of the girls in their different ways served their country and their family. Here you can see Sarah and Mary travelled with Winston when he went to international conferences at Tehran, Yalta and Potsdam, and they mixed with, you know, Stalin, de Gaulle and Roosevelt. And they were there sort of as proxies for Clementine, because it was thought that Winston had a heart attack when he visited the White House. And after that, he always had to travel with his doctor, Lord Moran, but he also needed a member of the family there. And Clementine didn't want to travel all the time. So one of the daughters went in the place, and they could sort of say things to Winston that army officers and other people with them couldn't. And he would be able to talk to them and say what he felt about events. And that's recorded by Sarah in the letter she wrote home to Clementine. But as well as supporting their parents, they also did a lot of war work in their own right. Mary had a stellar war career, becoming a junior commander and getting an MBE for her work. And Sarah worked at RAF Medmenham in Buckinghamshire, being a photographic interpreter and involved in a lot of planning for invasions from photographs. And so all of this really won Winston's respect. And they did want to please him. I mean, Sarah gave up a promising acting career when her career was just about to take off to go and serve in the forces.
And you mentioned Sarah's role, and wasn't there an incident where she kind of had to correct Winston, who was the prime minister, and he hadn't quite got his intelligence right? Can you tell us about that?
Yes, that's a lovely anecdote. She went to Chequers one evening, and she rushed upstairs to see Winston, who just got out of his bath and was wrapped up in a large fluffy towel. And he was describing to her that Operation Torch, the invasion of North Africa, was about to begin. And Sarah corrected him on some point, and he went, "Well, how do you know about that?" And she said, "Well, actually, I've been working on it for several months." And he went, "Well, why didn't you tell me?" And she went, "There is such a thing as security, you know." But then the story went further, because he was so proud of what she'd been doing that Winston told Eleanor Roosevelt about it. And Eleanor Roosevelt used it in a speech about women's war work in Britain. And Sarah's superiors were not very impressed. And they said, you know, this is a leak of security. But once they found that it was Winston who told Eleanor Roosevelt, she was let off.
Jolly good. And she did, I mean, she did continue, to travel with her father. And again, can you describe what's going on here?
Yeah, I love this photograph. In this photograph, you can see Roosevelt and Churchill, who really look like a couple of elderly gentlemen on a day out, don't they, at Blackpool or somewhere. And they're with actually their two daughters. The other woman in the picture is Anna Batiga, who is Roosevelt's daughter. And it's a very poignant photo because it was taken just a few weeks before Roosevelt died. And the Churchills and Roosevelts had worked so closely together. Mary and Sarah met Roosevelt and knew him quite well and really admired and loved him. And so it was a massive thing for them all when Roosevelt died just towards the end of the war. But I think this photograph captures the informality and that both men depended on their families at this time. They were the only people you could really trust in wartime, which made you quite isolated from any friends.
Yeah. And again, I'm sorry to dart around a little bit, but as we're talking about Sarah at the moment, I know that her letter, the letter you found, had such an important effect on you. And I just want to talk a little bit about her life, because she was a pretty sparky woman, and the nickname that she gave herself, Rachel.
Yes, she called herself the Mule because she was obstinate and she didn't breed. And out of any of the children, I mean, you might disagree with me, Josh, and maybe I'm being a bit unfair, but I think she had most of Winston's touch of genius. She was almost a great actress, nearly a great beauty, but she never quite made it. You can see here, she went to Hollywood and appeared with Fred Astaire in the film Royal Wedding in 1951, and her career seemed to be taking off. But then she had this self-destructive streak, rather like Randolph, and like him, she was an alcoholic and reacted very badly to alcohol. And she also had a number of tragic encounters with men right from her early days. And she was the most rebellious of the daughters. She wanted to make her own way in the world. And rather than, do what the rest of the family did, she became a showgirl and then an actress. And, that was quite a shock in the 1930s for someone from such a sort of aristocratic background to go and do that. And then she eloped with her first husband. She got married without her parents knowing it was going to happen to her second husband. And there was all this going on. She was a very conflicted character because she wanted to please her parents, but she also felt the need to rebel against them as well. So I find her a very fascinating character. And actually, she's almost like a sort of twin, I feel, with Randolph. They both wrote, I thought, very similar letters to Winston. And they were perhaps the most similar of the siblings, I felt. I don't know what you think, Josh.
Yeah, I'd agree. I think temperamentally, they're really similar. But they both have that sort of wildness, but also that sort of insatiable need for affection. You know, a sort of, I mean, and I think Rachel was really, really clever to point out that contradiction to be at the heart of the family, but also to create an identity for themselves. And I think one of the interesting similarities between both of them is they both spent a lot of their lives in the States as if that they felt they needed to have the Atlantic between them and their family. But that was what, that was a stage that they could kind of create roles for themselves, which they weren't, that a chance they wouldn't have if they had stayed in England. The Churchill name opened doors, but it didn't define them in the way that it did in England.
What did Randolph do in the States, Josh?
Well, he started off, he actually left Oxford, where he'd been sort of phenomenally idle, to do a speaking tour. He got briefly engaged, and then came back he was paid a huge amount of money, but he was so sort of extravagant in his spending that he'd live in suites and drink champagne all the time. He actually came back in debt. And then I think he did a lot of the same after the war as well. I mean, I think it was a good way of him escaping the messes he made in his own life, of making some money, I think he had a genuine fondness for America and Americans, so he almost married one. Mm-hmm. He was very close to the Kennedys. I think he was supposed to be writing John F. Kennedy's biography. He was scheduled to write it after he finished his big biography of his father, but clearly he died before he finished either. In fact, died about 8 hours after Bobby Kennedy was assassinated. So there's a strange connection. And yeah, he was quite intimately involved in securing Winston's citizenship, honorary citizenship of the States. So yeah, I think he had a strong affinity, and I think he could play a very sort of classic role. Apparently his accent was so English that people thought he was speaking French, and he could get away with things and then come back.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think it was just a way of being themselves. But they were good.
I think it's really interesting what you said about that for Sarah and Randolph, about America suiting them really well, because Sarah was so much bigger in the States than she was here. And I think that's one of the reasons no one's much heard of her here. Whereas in the United States, she was on the cover of Life magazine and suddenly overnight became really well known. And also she was involved in the early days of television in the Hallmark Hall of Fame. And I love this point that actually she played Ophelia in Hamlet, and more people saw that Hamlet, it was the first televised version, than it said had seen Hamlet in the 400 years since Shakespeare had written. So she was this much better known character there. And maybe it was the Jerome blood, Jenny Jerome, Winston's mother's blood, that made them feel so at home in America. But I think sadly also Randolph and Sarah had that Jerome thing that Jenny Jerome said, people with the Jerome blood should never drink because they're born intoxicated. And that was certainly true for Randolph and Sarah, because Sarah reacted so badly to alcohol. She became a sort of totally different person.
Yeah. I just had a slight senior moment there. That's what I was going to ask you. So you mentioned Randolph, being engaged or wanting to become engaged, but he did marry, didn't he?
Yeah, he married twice. I mean, the first marriage came within about very early on in the Second World War. He proposed to 8 women before he finally found someone who would say yes. And the person he married was Pamela Digby, who was a 19-year-old girl from a provincial aristocratic family. Her family house was actually the family home of the first Winston Churchill, 300 years previously.
I didn't realise that.
And I mean, they were grand enough that she found Chartwell sort of small and pokey. But she was bored. She was expecting quite a dull life before marrying someone quite dull. And then suddenly this sort of enfant terrible swept into her life, proposed within about a week, maybe within 2 dates, actually. The entire, it felt like half of London were telling her not to marry him. But I think she thought, she sort of saw it as a ticket out into a different life. And although she very quickly realised that Randolph might have been, he's probably one of the worst husbands of the 20th century. He was in love with someone when they married. He is incapable of being faithful. He drank in the same way that Sarah did. He started arguments with everybody. That he used the money that they got given for their wedding presents to buy gifts for his old girlfriends. But could be charming and fun and kind. And I mean, she made Winston incredibly happy by giving him another grandson.
Can I
think of? Oh, sorry.
No, I was going to say, I just want to leap in, because again, I am wearing my Blenheim hat, as I always do. And as you say, Winston was incredibly happy because Randolph and Pamela gave him his first grandchild. A grandchild. And can you tell me that little anecdote about how Randolph's son came to be called Winston?
So I think there was a cousin born maybe a week or two beforehand, the son of the Duke at the time.
He was born in July 1940, so a few months
about
before.
3 months beforehand. 3 months beforehand, and he was due to be called Winston and was already called Winston. I think you know this just as well as I do. But Winston Churchill, the Prime Minister, was absolutely adamant that his grandson should be called Winston, and clearly didn't believe that there should be another Winston in the family. So he phoned up the child's mother just after his own grandson had been born and insisted that they changed their child's name, which unbelievably they did. I think it's a really good example of Winston's sort of obsessiveness and his inability to, I mean, I don't think he ever really understood that other people had desires or needs. He was so focused on satisfying his own. So good at persuading other people to do what he wanted them to do, which is obviously a wonderful talent, but does have consequences for the people around you. I think it's a lot about. So it says a lot about his eccentricity, and the sort of. It's a story that when you first hear it, you sort of laugh, and then you kind of think about it again, and you think there are sort of strange undercurrents there. It's not entirely funny.
Because Josh, when you say he phoned the child's mother, now the child's mother was the 10th Duchess of Marlborough. So it's not dear old Mrs. Smith down the road. No. And this photograph I think is charming, and there's the 10th Duchess with her 3 daughters, and Lord Charles, as he then became known, as a toddler. But as I say, I think it's a mark of, Winston. The family was terribly important to him, and as you say, the whole idea of dynasty, destiny, etc. And you mentioned, I didn't know that Pamela Digby's family lived in the home of the first Winston.
Yeah, Minturn, yeah.
So that was the first Winston Churchill was the father of the first Duke of Marlborough. So it's amazing, really, and no wonder Winston had such grandiose ideas.
Yeah, and I think also just that willingness and that he wanted to choreograph Randolph, his own son's life to that extent.
Yeah,
he was creating a path for Randolph, and I don't think Randolph would say through most of his life that his most fervent desire would be to become Prime Minister, but I don't really know whether that was ever his own idea or his own ambition, or one that was just implanted within him by his father, and he knew that there was no other route to pleasing his father than following him into politics.
Now, I was going to save this question till the end, but I feel like I'm going to ask it now. So if it had been in Winston's gift, or if the role was an inherited one, like, becoming king or queen, do you think that in the end, Winston would have made Randolph a prime minister?
So yeah, I mean, I think there is actually a sort of real world test case of that, in that towards the end of his life, he was offered the chance to become the Duke of London, I think, and he turned it down. And his stated reason was that he didn't want to affect Randolph's political chances by, making him become a lord, and so meaning that he couldn't go into the Houses of Parliament. But I think there was a sort of slightly more malicious explanation, was that he didn't trust Randolph to sort of not sully the reputation of that dukedom. And so I think, the question really depends on when you ask it. I think if you'd asked it at any time up to about 1945, I think unquestionably he'd say yes. And then after that, I'm not so sure he would. No. So
let's say we ask it after his second stint as prime minister. So we're in the 1950s.
No, I don't think he would have. No, I mean, he thought very long and hard about entrusting him with the job of writing his biography, and eventually did choose to. But I think before the war, he couldn't see Randolph's faults, or saw what other people saw as faults as strengths. And after the war, I think he was far, far more aware of Randolph's faults, because you would have to have been blind not to have seen how chaotic and catastrophic and unhappy and unsuited to any sort of responsible position Randolph had become.
I just want to show, this was a photograph, Josh, that you gave me, and you mentioned this business of Dorian Gray. And when we looked at this earlier, I said, oh gosh, he looks really, really old to be that little child's father. Do you remember your comment?
Yeah, I think it's unfortunately, you could use it as a warning not to drink 2 bottles of whiskey and smoke 100 cigarettes a day, because Randolph poisoned himself, really. Like Sarah, if you look at it another way, that both of them committed a very slow form of suicide, whether consciously or not. They both must have known at some point that they were ensuring they wouldn't live beyond, their Randolph was in his late 50s, and I think Sarah was in her early 60s. That he destroyed his body, and his mind just about survived right to the end. But he became, he went from being this beautiful, live child to being this sort of gross, bloated man with sort of fish-like grey pallor, hacking cough, could barely walk, which is very much like his sort of physical decline mirrored Winston's almost exactly. But Winston was 30 years older, so.
Gosh, well. And amazingly, we're almost out of time. So I don't want to end on this sad note. It's not in my nature. So I want you, please, if you could think of any either kind of moments when you would say that the children were happy, or did any of them have a happy life? And I know we there's so much more we could talk about, and we've barely touched on Mary, for example. So Rachel, was there any happiness in the children's lives?
Definitely. I think the happiest time for the girls was during the war, and they were totally fulfilled. They were stretched, they were doing their own things, they were pleasing their parents. And I think that can be sort of pictured. There was a dinner to celebrate Winston's 70th birthday near the end of the war. And at the end, he drank a toast to his family, saying they were the dearest of the dear, and went round and clinked glasses with each of them in turn. And Mary said that nearly made her cry. And I think that moment probably was one of the happiest for all of them, because they'd pleased their parents and they'd achieved something. So there was happiness. And, I think that is probably when they were all happiest.
Excellent. Josh, anything?
I'd say for Randolph, it was towards the end of his life, and it was the day he got a telegram from Winston telling him that he'd been appointed as his biographer. And at the time, he was in a sort of menage a trois with a neighbour, a very beautiful sort of artist, who had just been to visit him, and was just driving off along the drive of his country mansion, and he chased after her, the sort of portly figure, saying, "He chose me, he chose me, he chose me." And I think that moment, and also everything it represented, it was it was an honor to be chosen by his father, and it meant that he could play this sort of role in his father's life that he'd never been able to find before, and sort of write himself into the Churchill story. And I think that he probably was happy then, and became a lot happier afterwards.
Good. Right, now I think it's really, really important, because I'm sure people will be watching and they'll be going, wow, and what was the name of the book? So, seriously, we have really only touched the tip of the iceberg. There's so much. The stories are fascinating, and the two books complement each other so well. So, Rachel, your book, The Churchill Girls; Josh, yours, Churchill and Son, I think must have read. We're now stocking up for Christmas, obviously. The books are available in all good bookshops and in the Palace bookshop. So I think rush out and get your copy now. Rachel, Josh, it's been an absolute pleasure to have you here this afternoon. What can I say? You've been so kind to give up your time. Thank you.
Thank you so much for having us. Thank you. Really enjoyed it.
Absolute pleasure. All right. See you soon.
Bye.
Bye. Bye-bye.